Before sunrise, the Ararat Plain is almost without color. The mountains are dark silhouettes against a paling sky. Cold air settles close to the ground. Smoke begins to lift from the first hearths, and somewhere beyond the walls of Artaxata, a caravan is already moving toward the river. Then the city wakes. Doors open. Bronze and iron ring from workshops. Servants check jars of wine and grain in storerooms. Traders argue over weights, prices, and distance. Hooves strike packed earth at the gates. On the heights, guards search the roads for dust. And somewhere inside a royal compound, men may be weighing a question that could decide whether their kingdom remains independent. Rome or Parthia? Resistance or compromise? War, alliance, or one more carefully measured delay? In a frontier kingdom, one decision can redraw a map. A wrong one can erase a dynasty. But for the moment, Artaxata is alive. If we strip away 2,000 years of collapse, rebuilding, conquest, earthquakes, soil, and silence, another Armenia comes into view. Not a distant edge of the ancient world, but a kingdom positioned where some of its most powerful political systems, trade routes, languages, and cultural traditions met. And this city is only one layer of the story. To understand how that world was created, we have to travel back before Artaxata, before the great Armenian kings, and even before the name Armenia appears in the written record. We have to begin with the thing that shaped almost everything that followed: the land. The Armenian Highlands rise between the Caucasus, Anatolia, northern Mesopotamia, and the Iranian Plateau, extending far beyond the borders of the modern Republic of Armenia. This is a landscape of volcanic massifs, high plateaus, deep valleys, river basins, and mountain passes, where geography could be as decisive as any army. A snowbound pass could isolate neighboring districts for months. In summer, the same route could become a corridor for merchants, soldiers, craftsmen, beliefs, technologies, and languages. The mountains protected communities, but they never sealed them away. Movement was difficult here, not impossible. And precisely because movement was difficult, the routes that worked mattered enormously. Ancient Armenia developed at a crossroads, but it was a crossroads with walls of stone and seasons of snow. Long before Greek and Roman authors described Armenia, Bronze and Iron Age communities had already covered the highlands with settlements, fortified centers, fields, herds, workshops, and exchange networks. Then, in the 9th century BCE, a new political power emerged around Lake Van, the kingdom known in its own inscriptions as Bianili, and to the Assyrians as Urartu. This was more than another cluster of mountain strongholds. Urartian kings built fortresses, temples, storehouses, irrigation works, and a written administrative system. Their authority expanded northward into the Ararat Plain, turning prominent hills into military positions, storage centers, ritual spaces, and statements of royal power. One of those hills still rises inside modern Yerevan. In 782 BCE, King Argishti I founded the fortress of Erebuni on Arin Bird. We know the date not from a medieval chronicle or a later legend, but because the builders left it in stone. A cuneiform foundation inscription records the act of construction, giving us something unusually direct in ancient history: a ruler announcing a foundation at a place that can still be visited today. Erebuni is often described as one of the ancient urban predecessors of Yerevan. But to understand what that really means, we have to stop imagining the pale, broken walls that survive now. Restore the height, restore the color. Stone foundations supported mud brick walls. Important interiors were plastered and painted. Ceremonial rooms stood beside storerooms and enormous ceramic vessels. A temple was associated with Haldi, the principal god of the Urartian state. Grain and wine were stored on a scale far beyond ordinary household needs. Outside the fortress, wind, dust, fields, livestock, and the wide plain below. Inside, controlled entrances, painted surfaces, measured storage, ritual, administration, soldiers, and officials moving through spaces designed to make authority visible. A fortress like Erebuni defended territory, but it also organized it. Power was not abstract here. It had walls, inventories, gates, and grain. And then, within roughly 2 centuries, the political system behind those walls fractured. By the late 7th and early 6th centuries BCE, Urartu had ceased to exist as a kingdom. Why this happened remains debated. Warfare, internal disruption, changing regional powers, and population movements may all have contributed, perhaps in combination.
What the evidence does not support is the simplest cinematic version, one dramatic night in which one civilization vanished and another instantly replaced it. The transition was slower, messier, and far more interesting. This is also where any serious reconstruction has to resist a tempting shortcut. Urartu cannot simply be renamed Early Armenia. The Urartian language was not Armenian. It belonged to the Hurro-Urartian language family. How Urartian populations, Armenian-speaking groups, and other communities contributed to the later population of the Highlands remains a subject of scholarly debate. But continuity does not require identity. What is much clearer is that later Armenia developed in a landscape already transformed by Urartian fortifications, settlement, agriculture, and water management. Roads had been used, fields had been irrigated, strategic hills had already been chosen, administrative habits had already existed. There was no empty stage between the two worlds. By around 520 BCE, another name enters the record. In the multilingual Behistun inscription of the Achaemenid king Darius I, the old Persian text refers to Armenia. The inscription describes revolts across the empire and their suppression. It is one of the earliest secure written attestations of the name familiar to the outside world today. By then, the political scale had changed again. The Highlands were part of the Achaemenid Empire, a system stretching from the eastern Mediterranean deep into Asia. Local elites operated within an imperial world shaped by Iranian court traditions, Aramaic administration, tribute, military obligations, and long-distance communication. The Achaemenid Empire would eventually collapse. Its influence would not. Iranian political and aristocratic traditions remained deeply embedded in Armenia for centuries. Administrative habits outlived the rulers who had once imposed them. Cultural influence did not move like an army that arrived one year and withdrew the next. It persisted in titles, names, elite behavior, ritual, and the language through which power was expressed. In the winter of 401 to 400 BCE, history gives us a completely different kind of image. A Greek mercenary force, retreating from the interior of the Persian Empire, crossed Armenian territory. Among them was Xenophon, soldier and writer. His account preserves one of the most intimate snapshots we have of everyday life in the region. He describes houses sunk into the ground, spacious below, with access arranged differently for people and animals. Inside were sheep, goats, cattle, grain, barley, beans, and a strong barley drink stored in large vessels and consumed through reeds. For a few lines, imperial history disappears. There is no throne room, no monumental inscription, no royal procession. There is winter, food, animals, stored grain, warmth held below ground, families living in architecture adapted to a climate that could turn exposure into danger. That small scene matters because ancient Armenia was never built only by kings. It was also built through ordinary decisions repeated for generations. Where to dig, what to grow, what to store, when to move herds, whom to trade with, and how to survive until spring. Then another empire fell, and another cultural world arrived. After Alexander the Great shattered Achaemenid power, the region entered the Hellenistic age. Yet Armenia did not simply become a Greek province. Local dynasties, especially the Orontids, continued to rule. Greek influence spread through coinage, prestige culture, urban forms, diplomacy, and art, while Iranian traditions remained deeply rooted in political life. The result was a layered political culture, in which older traditions survived inside new ones. And in the early 2nd century BCE, That layered world produced a new dynasty and a new capital. After the defeat of the Seleucid king Antiochus III by Rome, Artaxias I emerged as an independent ruler in Greater Armenia around 189 BCE. His reign marks the rise of the Artaxid dynasty. Around the 180s BCE, he founded Artaxata, Artaxata, in the Ararat Plain, near the Araxes River. Ancient tradition adds one of the most irresistible stories in Armenian history. Later authors claim that Hannibal, the Carthaginian commander who had once brought Rome close to catastrophe, advised Artaxias on the location or design of the city during his exile in the east. The image is almost too perfect. Rome's greatest enemy, helping to shape an Armenian capital. It is also unproven. Archaeology cannot confirm Hannibal's personal involvement, and the story survives through later literary tradition. It may preserve a real memory, or it may have grown because the association gave the city prestige. We cannot treat it as established fact. But Artaxata itself needs no legend to be impressive. Its scale and its strategic position were real without one. And with every generation of excavation, the city becomes more complicated rather than less. Artaxias left another kind of evidence across the countryside. Stone boundary markers carrying Aramaic inscriptions. Set beside cultivated land, these stones turned royal authority into something physical. A boundary could be read. A field could be defined. Ownership and agricultural space could be marked under the name of the king. They reveal a monarchy concerned with far more than campaigns and diplomacy. It was also reaching into land, property, and the organization of the countryside. The writing cut into those stones is as revealing as the stones themselves. It is not Greek, and it is not written in an Armenian alphabet. That alphabet did not yet exist. The inscriptions use Aramaic, the administrative language that had served the Achaemenid world for centuries. Long after Achaemenid rule had ended, one of its most practical instruments of government was still at work. Now move from the boundary stone back towards the capital, and the political texture becomes visible in motion. Armenian was spoken across the kingdom, though it had not yet acquired its own alphabet. Iranian aristocratic traditions remained powerful. Aramaic could serve administration. Greek became increasingly visible in coinage, elite culture, diplomacy, and international exchange. A scribe could work in one written tradition, while a merchant handled a coin carrying another. An aristocrat could bear an Iranian name in an Armenian court. These layers overlapped in daily life without requiring one another to disappear. The kingdom was learning to operate through several cultural languages at once. Artaxiat spread across a chain of hills and the lower ground near the Araxes and Metsamor rivers. Its defenses used the terrain, while its position connected the capital to routes leading towards the Iranian world, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. Geography did more than protect the city. It fed it. Modern Armenian-German excavations have revealed regular building plans, residential areas, painted plaster, local and imported ceramics, craft activity, and evidence of long-distance connections. Geophysical work has also shown that parts of the lower city extended farther than earlier excavations alone had suggested. Every new survey has made the capital larger, denser, and more complicated than the ruined field first appears. So erase the marble fantasy. Picture a working capital. Stone bases carrying mud brick walls, timber roofs throwing broken shade across plastered rooms, courtyards opening into storerooms, workshop smoke drifting above roofs, dust under sandals, animals pressing through gates, carts slowing at narrow approaches, and beyond all of it, the river landscape that made movement and exchange possible. On a market morning, Armenian speech would have belonged to the local soundscape, while the wider world appeared in objects and people. A merchant might know some Greek or Aramaic. A coin could carry Hellenistic imagery. An aristocrat might bear an Iranian name. A luxury object could have crossed several political frontiers before reaching a household near the Araxes. The city did not merely stand between worlds. Its daily life was made from their contact. Religion carried the same layered character. Iranian influence was profound. Aramazd was closely connected with Ahura Mazda, while Anahit and Mir also had strong Iranian associations. Vahagn and other deities carried traditions that developed locally, and during the Hellenistic period, some gods were identified with Greek counterparts. A sanctuary, an image, a divine name, and the language used to describe them could all preserve different histories at once. Here, however, the reconstruction has to slow down. Certainty has limits. Many literary descriptions of pre-Christian Armenian religion were written centuries later by Christian authors looking back on a religious world that had already changed. Archaeology can reveal sanctuaries, images, offerings, figurines, architectural settings, and ritual spaces. It can show where people gathered and what material traces they left behind. It cannot recover every ceremony, every prayer, every gesture, or every local variation. Kingship requires the same caution, but it also gives us another vivid picture of the kingdom's position. An Armenian ruler had to make sense to several audiences at once. Before local nobles, he had to appear legitimate within inherited traditions. To Eastern neighbors, he operated in a political culture deeply shaped by Iranian models of monarchy. To the Hellenistic world, he could speak through titles, coins, diplomacy, and architecture that were immediately recognizable beyond Armenia. The same ruler could face inward toward his aristocracy and outward toward rival courts without using exactly the same political language.
For a time, that flexibility became a source of strength. And then came the ruler who pushed that system farther than anyone before him, Tigranes the Great. He took the throne around 95 BCE. Ancient sources say that he had spent years as a hostage at the Parthian court and secured his return by conceding disputed territories. It is hardly the opening one would invent for the future ruler of an expanding empire. Yet within 2 decades, the map had changed. Tigranes absorbed Xenophon, expanded Armenian power into neighboring regions, exploited weakness in the Seleucid kingdom and changes in Parthian power, and extended his authority into northern Mesopotamia and Syria. For a brief period, Armenia stood at the center of one of the dominant political powers in the Near East. Tigranes adopted the title King of Kings. His coins turned that claim into an image small enough to hold between 2 fingers. The king wears the distinctive Armenian tiara. Greek inscriptions and Hellenistic divine imagery place his monarchy inside an international visual language. In one piece of silver, we can see Armenian kingship, imperial ambition, and Hellenistic presentation compressed into a political message. Even the decoration of the tiara has produced a mystery. Some researchers have proposed that a star-like emblem, visible on certain coins, may represent Halley's comet, which was seen in 87 BCE. The astronomical timing makes the suggestion possible, and the idea is striking. But striking is not the same as proven. The emblem may have had another symbolic meaning. The evidence does not allow the comet interpretation to be presented as fact. Sometimes the most valuable thing an ancient coin preserves is the question it refuses to settle. Tigranes also created a new capital, Tigranocerta, intended to embody the scale of his expanded realm. Ancient texts describe a major royal city, but the precise identification of the capital remains debated, and several sites have been proposed. That uncertainty matters. We can reconstruct the political purpose of Tigranocerta with confidence. A new center for a kingdom that had outgrown its earlier scale. But any detailed recreation of its streets, monuments, and skyline must remain cautious where the archaeology is not secure. And while Tigranes was building an empire, another empire was moving closer, Rome. Tigranes was allied by marriage with Mithridates VI of Pontus, one of Rome's most formidable eastern enemies. That alliance pulled Armenia into the Mithridatic Wars. In 69 BCE, the Roman commander Lucullus invaded and captured Tigranocerta. In 66 BCE, Pompey advanced into Armenia. At that moment, Tigranes faced the question that would haunt Armenian rulers for centuries: fight a stronger imperial power to the end, or surrender part of what you have built to preserve the core. He chose survival. Tigranes reached an agreement with Pompey,
surrendered most of his conquests, and retained the Armenia throne. The empire contracted almost as quickly as it had expanded. The kingdom remained, and from this point forward, survival itself became the greater strategic achievement. Armenia now stood between Rome and Parthia, two superpowers that understood the same geographic truth. Control over the Armenian throne meant leverage across the Caucasus and the northern approaches to Mesopotamia. Rome backed one claimant, Parthia backed another. Armenian nobles supported, rejected, or maneuvered around outside candidates. Dynastic marriages became instruments of policy. A coronation could become an international crisis. A disputed succession could bring foreign armies across the frontier. Yet the rivalry of the two empires also created space. At times, Armenian elites could use one power to resist the other. The kingdom did not always control the game, but it was not merely a passive square on someone else's board. The most theatrical example came in the 1st century CE. The Parthian king, Vologases I, supported his brother Tiridates for the Armenian throne. Rome resisted. Years of warfare followed. Eventually, in 63 CE, the settlement associated with Randea produced an extraordinary compromise. Tiridates, a Parthian Arsacid prince, would rule Armenia, but his royal authority would receive formal recognition from the Roman emperor. 3 years later, Tiridates traveled to Rome. Imagine the journey. Months of movement westward. An Armenian king approaching the center of the empire that had fought to keep him from the throne. In 66 CE, before a Roman audience, Nero placed the diadem on Tiridates' head. One ceremony, 3 political meanings. To Roman propaganda, Nero had granted a crown. To the Parthian dynasty, their prince ruled Armenia. To Armenia, the compromise preserved a separate monarchy between the two giants. Diplomacy had done what conquest could not: create an arrangement all 3 sides could describe as a victory.
Back in Armenia, the royal culture of the Arsacid period could produce architecture as unexpected as the colonnaded monument at Garni. It is usually called the Temple of Garni. The dominant traditional interpretation places it in the 1st century CE, often in the reign of Tiridates I, and sometimes specifically around 77 CE. A Greek inscription found nearby names a king Tiridates and records construction at the fortress. The monument still refuses to give up every answer. The exact relationship between that inscription and the colonnaded building remains debated. So do the building's original date and function. It is often associated with Mir, a solar deity, while other scholars have proposed different interpretations, including a funerary function. The unanswered questions belong inside the Reconstruction because the evidence itself is incomplete. What the surviving architecture allows us to see is remarkable enough. A high podium, carved architectural ornament, and 24 Ionic columns made from dark local basalt. Around the monument stood a fortified royal complex with residential buildings and, in a later phase, a bath decorated with mosaics. And even the monument we see today has its own later history. The building collapsed in the devastating earthquake of 1679. Its modern standing form is the result of a careful scholarly reconstruction and restoration carried out from 1969 to 1975 under architect Alexander Sahinyan, using extensive study of the surviving architectural material. The silhouette is ancient in conception, but its survival into the present was not continuous. Now place the ancient structure back into its original royal landscape. At sunset, the effect must have been extraordinary. Classical proportions cut from volcanic stone, the dark columns catching low light above the gorge. Mediterranean architectural language translated into Armenian basalt and Armenian terrain. Garni does not show Armenia simply becoming Greek or Roman. It shows a royal culture, selecting forms known across the Mediterranean and making them work inside its own political and physical world. Foreign form could be adopted, recut, relocated, and given a new context without erasing what surrounded it. That pattern runs through the entire history. Rome, however, had not abandoned the idea of direct control. In 114 CE, Emperor Trajan, annexed Armenia as a Roman province during his eastern campaigns. For a brief moment, Rome did not want influence over an Armenian kingdom. It wanted administration. And at Artaxata, archaeologists have found the physical footprint of that ambition in concrete. A line of massive foundation blocks belongs to an unfinished Roman arched aqueduct. 17 foundations have been identified, some extending at least 3.5 meters into the ground. The construction uses Roman opus cementitium, and stamped roof tiles attest the presence of Legio IV Scifica in the area. The project appears to have begun during Trajan's occupation, when Artaxata was being incorporated into the infrastructure of a Roman province. Picture what the foundations imply. Surveyors had measured a route. Labor had been organized. Materials had been gathered. Roman engineers were planning not for a raid, not for a temporary camp, but for permanence. Then the emperor died. Trajan was gone in 117 CE. His successor, Hadrian, abandoned the new eastern province. The aqueduct was never completed. No finished line of arches ever carried water into Artaxata. Beneath the soil remained foundations for a future that had existed in imperial policy for only a few years. It is one of archaeology's most cinematic forms of failure, a monument that never reached the moment it was built for. There is no centuries-old ruin caused by a final catastrophe here. The story stops earlier, at interruption, before completion, with an imperial future already measured into the ground and then abandoned. Artaxata continued to change through later wars, destruction, rebuilding, and shifting patterns of occupation. Archaeologists do not uncover one frozen capital. They uncover several versions of a city occupying the same ground. The Artaxid Foundation, neighborhoods reshaped during Roman Parthian rivalry, later occupation, abandoned zones, burials, reused spaces, and new sacred architecture. By the early 4th century, another transformation had begun, one that would alter Armenia more deeply than any temporary annexation: Christianity. Armenian tradition places the conversion of King Tiridates III and the official adoption of Christianity in 301 CE, associated with Gregory the Illuminator. The precise chronology is debated by historians, and many details are preserved through later religious traditions rather than contemporary documentation. But the larger transformation is secure. In the early 4th century, the Armenian monarchy embraced Christianity, and Armenia is traditionally regarded as the first kingdom to adopt Christianity officially at state level. The shift went far beyond private belief. Over time, it would reshape institutions, sacred landscapes, art, political identity, burial practice, architecture, and eventually the written culture of the Armenian language itself. And beneath Artaxata, archaeology has now added a remarkable physical piece to that transition. In 2024, an Armenian-German team announced the discovery of a previously unknown monumental octagonal structure with cross-shaped extensions. The excavators interpret it as an early Christian church. Wooden remains from platforms in the extensions were radiocarbon dated to the middle of the 4th century CE. The building was roughly 30 meters across. It had a mortar floor, terracotta tiles, and fragments of marble imported from the Mediterranean, suggesting an interior that was far richer than the bare foundations visible today. The excavators described it as the oldest archaeologically documented church yet found in Armenia. Then the picture widened again. A 2025 geophysical study of the southwestern lower city published the results of the 2024 survey campaign, adding new information about the city's layout, defensive features, and the context of the early Christian building. As with any newly investigated site, excavation must continue to test chronology, function, and the relationship between structures. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the reconstruction. It is archaeology working as it should. A spectacular discovery is not the end of a question, but the beginning of a better one. And there is something almost perfect about finding that building at Artaxata. Beneath one ancient capital lie traces of earlier Urartian activity, Hellenistic urbanism, Armenian monarchy, Roman military ambition, layers shaped by Roman Parthian rivalry, and early Christianity.
the same ground carries worlds that once stood centuries apart. That is the central challenge in reconstructing ancient Armenia. There was never just one ancient Armenia. Walk from one reconstructed century into the next, and the country should change around us. Erebuni, in the 8th century BCE, belonged to the mud brick, painted interiors, storage systems, and state religion of Urartu. Artaxata, under the Artaxias, inhabited another political and urban world.
Tigranes ruled on a scale that transformed the kingdom's horizons. Arsacid Garni belonged to a later court culture again. Borders shifted, dynasties changed, administrative languages changed, religious systems changed, trade routes rose, declined, and redirected movement across the Highlands. 1,000 years cannot be restored honestly with a single visual vocabulary. In one century, sunstrikes painted plaster above mud brick walls. In another, a Hellenistic coin passes from hand to hand in a crowded capital. Mountain cold changes the weight of clothing and the pace of travel. Timber, basalt, packed earth, plaster, tile, and imported marble belong to different places and different moments. A road matters because of where it leads. A royal costume matters because of when it was worn. One Greek column cannot turn an entire city Greek. One Roman foundation cannot make Armenia permanently Roman. The deeper continuity lies elsewhere. Again and again, communities in the Armenian highlands encountered institutions, styles, languages, and political systems from beyond the region, then reshaped them locally. Aramaic continued to serve administration after the Achaemenids. Hellenistic visual language could be adopted without dissolving Armenian kingship. Iranian court traditions could coexist with Armenian speech. Rome and Parthia could exert enormous pressure without making Armenia culturally identical to either empire. At different moments, Armenia expanded, bargained, absorbed, resisted, and compromised. Its position between larger powers was dangerous, but it also demanded a political skill that appears again and again across the centuries. The ability to remain connected to several worlds without becoming a simple copy of any one of them. Now return to the Ararat Plain before dawn. The ruins begin to lose their silence. Walls rise again along the hills. Color returns to plaster. Storerooms fill. Smoke begins to move above rooftops. A merchant pulls a rope tight around a pack animal. A potter turns wet clay beneath steady hands. A child carries a small vessel across a courtyard. Somewhere a door bar lifts. Somewhere grain pours into a jar. A royal messenger arrives hard from the road, changes horses at the edge of the city, and disappears through the gate before the dust has settled. Beyond the walls, a road bends south and east. In the coming days, it may bring merchants, officials, diplomats, pilgrims, or an army.
The city cannot know which until something appears on the horizon. We know the names of kings because kings had stone, metal, monuments, and scribes. Most other names are gone. Armenian was spoken for centuries before the creation of the Armenian alphabet in the early 5th century CE, but those voices did not leave us a large written record in their own language. Much of the earlier world reaches us indirectly, through foreign authors, royal inscriptions written in other languages, coins worn by handling, broken pottery, animal bones, seeds, pigments, graves, building foundations, and faint changes in the soil where a wall once stood. A charred seed can tell us what was stored. A broken jar can reveal trade. A buried wall can redraw a city. A fragment of pigment can put color back onto a surface that has looked gray for centuries. The things once too ordinary to deserve a chronicle have become some of the most valuable witnesses we possess. That is what Reconstruction is really trying to recover. Not certainty where none exists, and not a perfect replay of the past, but dimension. No model can return every face, every sound, every smell, every gesture, or every street exactly as it was. The more honest ambition is harder, to give depth back to what time has flattened, while keeping the boundary between evidence and imagination visible. Where archaeology is clear, the reconstruction can be precise. Where the evidence breaks off,
the uncertainty has to remain visible too. Ancient Armenia was never one uninterrupted empire, one architecture, one religion, or one cultural formula. Across the centuries, it was a succession of kingdoms and communities shaped by mountains, river valleys, roads, rival powers, inherited traditions, foreign contacts, and repeated reinvention. That complexity is not something to simplify away. It is the story, and the ground is still answering back. At Artaxata, geophysical surveys have expanded our picture of the lower city beyond what excavation trenches alone could show. An aqueduct, once invisible beneath the soil, revealed a Roman provincial project that failed before it carried a drop of water. An octagonal early Christian structure changed the physical picture of Armenia's earliest Christian centuries. Each discovery has forced the reconstructed city to become more precise, and in some places, less certain. The ground has not finished answering every question. Today, wind crosses hills where houses once stood.
The Roman aqueduct remains unfinished. Painted walls survive only in fragments. Royal buildings have lost their roofs. Roads have shifted. River courses have changed. The voices of markets, barracks, sanctuaries, workshops, and courts are gone. From the surface, the ancient city can look empty. It is not empty. It is unread. And somewhere beneath a field, a slope, a courtyard buried by later occupation, or an unexcavated hill, may lie the object that changes the next reconstruction completely. A seal, a wall, a coin, a painted surface, a line of writing no one has seen for 2,000 years. Perhaps nothing monumental, perhaps something small enough to fit in a hand, yet precise enough to move a date, identify a building, reveal a name, or force an old assumption to be abandoned. Ancient Armenia did not disappear in a single moment. It receded beneath later centuries, layer by layer, stone by stone, room by room, century by century, and that is how it is returning.